Hi, this is Xeri for Poker Strategy with another user session review for Termi8r. And as you can see, this review will be a hand review. I got the hand histories which are interesting from Termi8r, and I replay them in a hand replayer. And I think we have got more time and we can go even more into detail than with like just reviewing a video I get from him. So I think we will mix up the future reviews, either hand reviewing videos or normal session reviews. Okay, let's start just with the first hand. We have Ace King suited in the cutoff. Of course, this is an open race and the big blind calls us. The only disadvantage of this replay is that we don't have stats, so in this case our opponent here is pretty loose with 80 VP-IP, 8 PFR, but it was only about 25 hands, so not very accurate, these stats. And his aggression factor was 1.3 and his when to showdown 27. Well, we don't hit the flop here, but we just face one opponent, so we will make a continuation bet. Let's see what Termi8r did. He makes the bet, but I think it's pot size, and I think it's too big, because our standard continuation bet is always 2/3 pot size, or never more than that. And even though the board is pretty drawy, I wouldn't bet that much. So first thing, bet like $1.40 here. This is usually enough to make him fold hands like Ace Jack or lower pocket pairs. But betting more here is usually just wasting money, because it has almost the same effect, but it costs us more. Okay, we get called. I think it's not very surprising that this loose guy calls us here with his ATVP-IP. And the turn doesn't help us. He checks again. And now Termi8r makes second barrel or pushes directly the turn. Let's just take a look at the hand. Well, in the end he lost to a pair of nines, but I think the flop play is still okay besides the bet size. But I really don't like the second barrel. First of all, betting the turn again if we have nothing is really advanced, and there aren't many spots where such a play is good or suitable. So for basic short stack strategy, I would almost never do that, because it's just too difficult to pick out the right spots. And on the other hand, most opponents on the lower limits are just too loose, and the second barrel is only profitable if you can achieve fold equity. But let's take a look at this flop. It's pretty drawy, and if he calls here, he usually has either 7, 9 or 10. He has sometimes an open-ended straight draw with an 8, or he could have a gut shot like with King Jack or Ace Jack if he's really loose, as well with a lower gut shot. That's usually his range here. And if we now push with these $2.50 in such a big pot, he's getting pretty decent odds, and he will call with any of these hands. And this means we have no fold equity and also only 6 remaining outs. So this is definitely not a spot where you should bet again. So to sum up, these second barrels are really tricky to play correctly, and against calling stations or showdown monkeys, it's not worth doing it. And on low limits, as I said, your opponents are just too loose in average, so you have no fold equity, and you really need experience to figure out the right spots for such a play. So in this case, or very often, or almost always, if you're still unimproved on the turn and are heads up, you should just check behind, especially if you are in position. Check behind. We still have 6 outs, and which lets us win in about 15%, or we will improve in about 15%, and this is still okay. But let me just add one thing. In this hand, I would push the turn if the deuce was in diamonds, or if there was any other diamond, because then we get a backdoor flush draw, and we have the overcard outs. This means we have like between 10 and 15 outs usually, with our flush draw outs plus our overcard outs, and our remaining equity is now really increasing. And if we then just achieve a little bit fold equity, this gets really profitable. So if you pick up a very strong draw on the turn, so at least 9 outs, sometimes an open-ender is still good enough. So if you pick up a good or strong draw, you could think of a second barrel. But this board basically is really bad for doing that, because as I explained before, we usually don't get many hands to fold. Okay, so let's now take a look at the next hand. Now Termi8r picked up pocket tens in the big blind. All players fold except the button. I think this is very often a pretty weak play, and well, tens nevertheless are a raise for us. I hope he raises. Yes, he does. But I think this raise is a bit too small. I would at least raise to $1.25, 5 big blinds, because we've got one limper, and I usually also count completers as limpers, so my personal raise in this spot is $1.50. But the difference between $1.50 and $1.25 is not that big, but $1 is really not enough, because this player here gets really decent, or gets more decent odds, and we don't like him to call basically very often, because he's got position, and this brings him big advantage, especially with pocket tens. There will often be a flop with overcards, and it's so much better to play such a hand in position. So if I'm out of position, I'm always raising these 4 big blinds plus 1 per limper, because I really need to protect my hand. Okay, well, as I said, the button gets good odds and he calls, and that's not a decent flop for us. Nevertheless, we are heads up and we c-bet. C-bet size is okay. It's a bit more than half pot size. Like maybe betting a bit more, like $1.30 or $1.40, but it's okay. And we get called. And on such a board, there aren't many worse hands than ours usually. A queen beats us an ace. Well, a 7 could be possible, but it's not as likely as the two other ones. And sometimes if you face a really bad opponent, you will see him calling with like King 10 or Jack 10, like those gutshot hands. But these hands are usually the only worse ones calling us here, and the king is therefore not a good card. It on the one hand completes the gutshot draws with Jack 10 or King Jack or King 10. King 10 also beat us now, and it's not really important that we now also have a gutshot, because it's only like 4 outs more for us. So the gutshot here is very weak, and it's not a good draw. That's why you should give up the hand here. Just check fold. He checks. Our opponent also checks behind, and again there's a rake on the river. But as I said, I don't see many worse hands. And now we get a really small bet. The pot odds we get are decent. We get 7.3 to 1, which means we need about 12% equity in order to call. So this is really not much. We will but just imagine which hand that's worse than ours will bet here. I don't see many hands. Well, if I've got reads and really face an aggressive opponent and have seen him making such a weak bluff on the river, I could call. But usually this bet just wants to get called. Bluff bets are usually bigger. Well, some bad players bluff this way, but without reads I would even fold, even though there's good odds. Well, if there wasn't a king, like just another rag, like a 5, we could think of a call, because now some gutshot draws have missed and are unimproved. And unimproved draws always increase the probability of bluffs, because an unimproved draw could maybe try to steal the pot. So if there was no king and some unimproved draws, maybe we could call, because like 12% being in front is really not much, so we could reach that. Well, but if you fold here, it's usually the best play. And let's see what is the result. Well, and it's really like I thought. These bets are often bets which want to get called. Yeah, and he has the ace. Well, so usually you should check fold on this river. The next hand was again pocket tens, but now we are in position. But now we're not. Again, a rather ugly flop for us. But again, heads up pot. C-bet 2/3 pot size should be the best line. Well, I said this bet size is okay for a drive flop before in the hand with ace queen 7 rainbow board, but I think this flop is too drawy or more drawy. Also has open-ended straight draws and flush draws possible, so I would bet 2/3 pot size here. So sometimes you can vary a bit. I definitely recommend to c-bet the drawy flops 2/3 pot size, and on dry flops it's not that bad, or it's not a problem if it's a bit less, like 60% pot size. Okay, I will talk a bit about the opponent. Termi8r sent me his stats, and it was 43 VPIP and 8% PFR. We had like 40 hands, so it's still not much, but it's a tendency, as well as his 38 went to showdown. So we could basically judge this opponent as loose passive. As far as I can remember, his aggression factor was also pretty low. Let's take a look. Yes, it was 0.6, so really a loose passive opponent. This means we can c-bet here. Usually I would bet like $1.50, $1.40 at least, just because the board is more drawy, as I said. But we can easily fold to a raise, because such an opponent would never raise a weaker hand than ours. He would at least have a check, and usually he only calls with a check. And that's nice. If we face a passive opponent, we can just c-bet, and if we get raised, we're pretty sure that we are behind. Well, he calls, not very surprising again, with 38 went to showdown. Turn doesn't change much, but we have not much reads about our opponent with just 40 hands, so just give up this hand. Termi8r checks, and there's a bet from the really passive opponent. Now Termi8r check raises all in. I don't like this play. He doesn't create fold equity with just like 40 cents more, so he will call any hand. Well, and he wins with 2-pair, and it really shows that he's a rather passive opponent if he just slow plays his 2-pair on this flop. Let's go back to the turn. Many hands from this review will deal with turn play situations. And Termi8r asked me when it's good to second barrel or not. But as I said before, it's usually just the best to give up. Your opponents are way too loose, so your second barrels will never be profitable. And it's, in my opinion, the same thing here. Even though he could often have a flush draw, or an open ender sometimes. Even though I give up here. 2 overcards is simply too much. But one variation could be, if the turn is like a queen or a spade, we could push directly. So this is the same thing. If we pick up a good draw on the turn, this usually justifies to push. And I really don't like to continue against this bet because he's so passive. So he should give up now. Let's go back to the flop. Often you can make your life way easier if you are able to push the flop directly. And to remember to fresh this up again, you can always push directly, or you should push directly as a c-bet if your c-bet would be more than half of your stack. So this means our c-bet is like $1.50, and this is less than half our stack. But if we had only a $3 stack, our c-bet would still be $1.50, but it's now as much as half of our remaining stack, and then we just invest so much money in the pot and haven't got much left, and then we should usually go broke directly, because we then achieve the maximum fold equity and usually protect our hand the best. With like $3, just push the flop directly. Especially against a loose opponent, this is pretty decent. He will of course call with king or a jack, but also with his draws. And this means if he calls with worse hands than ours, this makes good profit for us. And besides that, if he's really pre-flop so loose, if his pre-flop calling range is so loose as the 43 VPIP says, then he will also have so many hands which he should fold here, like ace 10 or ace queen are pretty weak hands here. Also all the low pocket pairs or lower suited connectors or off-suited connectors and gappers, all these hands he should fold, and all these hands are worse than our pocket tens. And even with a bigger stack, it's sometimes possible to push. Well, this stack is, I think, it's too big, but with like $3.40, maybe $3.50, a push against a really bad opponent is possible, because a really bad opponent will even call with worse hands. Like if you know that an opponent calls the flop with any pair, he will call our push also with lower pocket pairs like pocket nines or pocket 8s, 7s, and there we are way ahead. So against a really bad opponent, it's also better to push directly. And one thing here, it really makes it easier for you, because if this bad opponent who calls the flop very loose calls your normal c-bet, and we are still unimproved on such a turn, but it's possible that he has a lower pocket pair than ours, or just ace queen or ace 10 besides the other draws, then we really have a hard decision. We cannot tell whether we are in front often enough or not. So against these opponents who just call so much on the flop, and where you would have a very hard decision on the turn, I think pushing the flop is better, as long as the ratio between remaining stack and pot is okay. I think it should usually not be bigger than 1.5 to 1, so remaining stack to pot 1.5 to 1. If the ratio is bigger, then only under special circumstances, like I said, against a very bad opponent. Okay, let's take a look at the next hand. And it was pocket 8s in the small blind. There are 3 limpers, according to the starting hands chart. We should raise here, because limpers are usually pretty weak, especially in later positions. If they limp, they usually have a very weak hand. And Termi8r raised. Again, I think the raise is a bit too small. It would be 1.75 would be the standard raise. So really raise enough if you're out of position. It's not decent if you have a multi-way pot here, if, as now, this opponent calls and all the others also call, then it's really ugly, because with 8s they will often be over cards. And unfortunately those two fold, and we can see the flop heads up. Heads up means no matter what we have, we make a continuation bet, and 2/3 pot size would be about $2.40, $2.50. So definitely every c-bet, every usual c-bet, even half pot size c-bet is so much that we already commit ourselves. So again, our stack is smaller than the pot on the flop, so just push directly here. Our opponent, well, if he has the ace or a 6, we are dead almost, but he will so often have a hand like king queen, queen jack, something like this, or lower pocket pairs, 7, 8 suited. So definitely so many weaker hands than ours. In this case, he has the ace, not decent for us. So, but with just like such a small stack, it's definitely profitable to push directly, because every normal c-bet commits you, because you already invest so much money. Let's just get back a bit, just to the point where we raise pre-flop. I think raising out of position is okay, especially against those weak limpers here in late and middle position. But as soon as you invest like more than half of your stack with a raise, I would think of pushing directly, because if you raise to like, if there was another limper and you would have to raise to $2, and only if someone calls, you're anyway committed on any flop, because your remaining stack is so small. And if you really have to invest more than half of your stack with a normal raise, then I would push directly. And it's really decent for us to pick up these blinds. It's like $1.10, and it's a decent result. And even if a person calls our push, if an opponent calls our push, our hand is usually favored against the limping range, because usually the better pocket pairs get raised. So I really recommend to push directly if you commit more than half of your stack, and this really makes your life much easier and is still really decent to pick up the blinds. Okay, now he again has a pocket pair and there's a limper, and he decides to raise. I think it's okay, but according to starting hands chart it's to lose. So if you're just playing basic short stick strategy, you shouldn't raise in MP3 with like pocket sevens. Just play according to the starting hands chart. The problem here is simply that if one of these opponents calls, we are out of position, and playing out of position is always ugly for us, because we always have to act first. So in the cutoff or on the button, it's a good race, but usually I think it's too early. But in this case, if I take a look at the stats I got from Termi8r about C house, he has 80 hands from C house, and so far he has a 84 VPIP and 5 PFR. That's really, really loose. And I think 80 hands are, of course, not enough hands to really prove that those values are true, but the tendency is really obvious that we face a loose passive opponent, and therefore pocket sevens against such a bad opponent are just strong. He could limp with so much here. So overall I think this hand is okay, but you have to think about the fact that he's so loose, which means he will call almost any hand. He will call your raise, so you will have to be able to play with a weaker hand like pocket sevens, which is one of the weakest hands in our range. You will have to be able to play them profitable too if you raise that. So the flop is okay. There's one overcard, but we have a gut shot. Let's take a look at the action. He checks, and strangely Termi8r also checks. I don't know why. Let's just take a look at the hand. We get a bet, and he just calls the bet, and then there's a king, and he bets pretty hard. Well, and now Termi8r is folding. I don't think it's played correctly. Key point is that he gives up the initiative on the flop. And you see what happens if you give up the initiative, meaning staying aggressive and having the initiative with making bets or raises, you just don't know where you stand. And well, 3 on the turn, and this min bet, we don't know what we have to do now. Should we raise or not? It's getting more difficult. Well, the call is okay, but I still prefer a raise now. But we don't have much information. We've given up the initiative and we don't know where we stand. And now on the river, he could bluff. He doesn't have to have a king. He could have so many other hands, but we don't know where we stand. And this is the effect of giving up the initiative. So as long as it's profitable and possible, you should keep the initiative in your hands, because then you will have hands like this one. And well, it's really hard now that there's a king, but it would be so much easier to c-bet the flop. Let's get back here. If you take a look at the stack sizes, our stack is not much bigger than the pot. Again, a c-bet would be a big part of our stack, so we should push directly here. And just imagine, this guy is so loose, he could limp call with so much, and only a 8, some 2 pairs or sets, maybe an overcard or overpair, or like 6, 7 beat us currently. But since he limps like with 80%, maybe let's say he limps with about, or his range is about 60% of all hands, he will have missed this flop so often, and we really need to protect our hand. And even if he has a 8 or 5-4, we've got 2 7s as our outs, and also 4 6s. So we're not drawing that. So just c-bet this flop, push directly, and you won't get into these problems. And now, well, as played, it's really ugly, because we give up initiative, and usually these loose passive opponents aren't bluffing that much. So I think the fold is okay, but you could really avoid this by c-betting the flop. Next hand, ace queen. There's a cutoff limp, so seems to be really weak. The player has 30 VP 7 PFR, about over 30 hands. So again, a rather loose passive opponent, but not too passive with his 7 PFR. I think he will raise many of his good hands. And just if he open limps here, he usually has a weak hand. Then we make a raise, and we get called. Well, again, heads up, he takes to us, and we should c-bet. Let's quickly calculate the ratio of our stack and the pot. Our stack is $3.40, and the pot is $2.85. So as I said before, we can basically almost always push profitable as a c-bet if our ratio is below 1.5 to 1. And that's why I really recommend to push this flop. And besides this ratio, there are some other points speaking for a push or a c-bet, of course. First, I think this board is really hard to hit. Well, a 9 or a 6 basically hit this flop. If he has a higher pair, we're of course also behind, but Usually there aren't many higher pocket pairs like tens and better in his range if he just limps in late position and is not really passive, because he usually raises these hands. So on the one hand, not many hands have hit this flop, and well, if we get called by a pair like pocket fives up to down to pocket deuces, we do not only have those 6 outs, we also have the nines as our outs, because every 9 makes a 2 pair in the board, and we win with our ace kicker, and his lower pocket pairs are worthless. So we if he calls with those lower pocket pairs, we get like 9 outs. So hidden outs in this flop. And that's why I definitely would push. It's just half pot size c-bet. Again, usually we c-bet 2/3 pot size. And 2/3 pot size would be half of our stack. And so just would be more than half of our stack. So we should push directly. Now we get a call here. The turn is still strange for us, or doesn't help us. He checks, and now we again have the difficult turn situation. So you can really avoid these turn situations if you push the flop as a c-bet. It makes it so much easier. And well, I have to say something. In advanced short stack strategy, when I play on really high limits, I do not always push directly with such remaining stack to pot ratios, because it's not often the best line. It's basically very often profitable, but we of course always like to have the best line, which gives us the maximum profit. But the point is, I know how to play those difficult turns because I have played so many hands and I'm experienced, and in addition I have many stats from my opponent. I do data mine all the tables, so I've got many thousands of hands for all the regular opponents, and I really have some accurate turn stats. With like only 30 hands you don't have accurate turn stats. The only thing you have is like a tendency for VP, IP, and PFR. And key point is to make correct turn play, like second barrels or something like this. You really need to evaluate your opponent on the turn, and since this is not very easy without stats and without reads, and if you're rather unexperienced, you should just avoid the difficult turn play by pushing the flop as often as possible. As I said, it's not the maximum EV, but it's, as long as you keep within those ratios, as I said, it stays profitable. And especially on such a board, you should do that. So far concerning this, and why I don't recommend those second barrels for the low limits. Well, he checks now because he doesn't know where he stands. And now there's a bet, and he pushes all in. I don't like this. I would just give up the hand basically, even though I sometimes face a bluff. But well, that's it. Without reads, we cannot tell. So raising here is definitely weak, false. So if you didn't see bet the flop as a push, you should fold here. And now we see he just no, it's not for Termi8r, it's for the straight. Now he made a hand on the river. Well, we can't really say what's his range if on this turn, and our stack isn't really big, so we don't create much fold equity. So pushing the flop is just the most simple play. Well, Termi8r still asked me when it's still profitable to push on this turn. Well, remember the things I said, it's really tricky, but if the turn was another 9, I would think of pushing if I didn't push the flop, because then the pocket pairs, the lower pocket pairs, are worthless, and it really gets less likely that he has something um, like this, like a 9 or a 6. Um, or if the turn is maybe a king or a jack, because this is called scare cards. You can A scare card is a card which is in our range, which is very likely in our range, and which we can represent with a bet, and this usually scares an opponent. Like, imagine another board, we had 9, 6 and a deuce. Our opponent has called the flop with 10, 9, and now there comes a king or an ace. And if we bet again, if we push directly, he really has to think about whether his 9 is still good, because a king and an ace are very often in our range. So we can really represent it no matter if we have it or not, which leads to the fact that we have good fold equity. But again, we are on low limits here, and I think it's senseless to bluff against someone who isn't scared, because he does not even know what's a range, and most of the opponents here don't have a clue about a range or scare cards at all. So you cannot scare a dumb person who doesn't think a bit about the board or our hand, but only about think about his holdings. And again, on higher limits, we would bluff with these scare cards on the turn, like a king or a jack here. But also we like to have a bigger stack, so we have more fold equity. But again, don't do this on low limits. Okay, well, and the next hand, Termi8r has pocket 9s. Of course, a raise in middle position, and the button calls, and Frankie also calls. I just love, because always if I play against a Frankie, I see horrible things, and most of the Frankies I played in my poker life before were so bad. So that's a general read I have for you. If you play against a Frank or a Frankie, just don't give him credit. Well, I think this is a really interesting hand, and I want to present the stats of those guys to you. MP1 has a 26 VPIP, 11 PFR, about 75 hands, and the button has a 36 VPIP and 11 PFR2, about 60 hands. And in this case, the stats are really important to make our continuation bet. Let's first take a look at the flop and the board and the opponents. We have two opponents, so usually we don't c-bet against two with our crap hands, but our hand on the one hand isn't that crappy, I think. What beats us here, a king or pocket 8s, and some higher pocket pairs? But if you take a look at the PFR, both have a 11 PFR. I think higher pocket pairs are not very likely, because an 11 PFR is aggressive. It's not really it's not very aggressive, but it's something like average. And in middle position, an 11 PFR player definitely raises his pocket 10s. So he never has a strong stronger pocket pair than us, except he was trapping. And he he will maybe sometimes call with pocket tens, but pocket jacks and better he should usually re-raise. So that's why we higher pocket pairs than ours are not very likely. So there's just pocket eights and a king. Pocket eights is really unlikely. It's not a big part of their range. It's really very unlikely. And also a king is not very likely because there are already two kings in the flop. And the third key point here is the VPIP. The looser they are, the higher the VPIP is, the more they could call with preflop. And this means the less part, or the smaller the part of her range will be that beats us. So this means if they call pretty loose preflop, the percentage of hands which beats us compared to the total range is really small. So now I got it. I hope you understood. And as a conclusion, well, they could call with ace jack, many lower pocket pairs, suited connectors. They are pretty loose and have so much, and well, as I said, it's really unlikely they beat us. And as a conclusion, I think this is a spot where you could push against 2, and I really like this move. Termi8r maybe thought a bit about this, what I said here, and he pushes. Well, if we see that we push, of course, with our small stack, we get called. Unfortunately, we play against a king. Well, but as I tried to explain, it's really unlikely that we are beat here against those loose and rather aggressive opponents. And to sum up, I think if you want to advance your game, you should always think about the possible ranges of your opponents. That's what I did through stats, or if you have reads. And if you have a kind of a feeling or an imagination for the range of your opponents, you can evaluate the flop again in comparison to your hand. So what I did was think about their ranges, compare and think how big is the part of their range that hits the flop, and how big is the part actually that beats me. In this case, it's not very big, and that's why I thought I'm very often in front and should still c-bet. Another thing is, if they are that loose, they could still call with lower pocket pairs, like pocket deuces to pocket sevens. And this is really decent for us because we are then way ahead. So take a look at the board and your hand in order to judge whether the c-bet is okay or not, always in comparison to the range of your opponents. Well, even though Termi8r sent me some other hands, I think I will finish now. I already talked pretty much, but I want to give a short summary. I've seen that he has got some problems with the c-bet size, and you should also be a bit more careful with the preflop raising size. And then, as I did in the last hand, try to include the stats into your thought process, as I did, and it will really make it much easier for you to judge whether you should bet or not. And just you have to gather experience. That's of course true, but the longer you do that, the easier this will get and the better your results will be. And then I also recommended that often the direct push as a c-bet makes it a lot easier for us and avoids difficult turn play. So really, if you invest a big part of your stack with a 2/3 or with your c-bet, then you should rather push directly. Well, and using second barrels on those low limits is usually not profitable, and if you're still unimproved on the turn and don't have a good draw, just give up. Well, I think that were the most important points of this review. And please feel free to give feedback. Termi8r also created a thread in the forum, in the sample hands section, where you can find all those hands from his session. Okay, this was Xeri for Poker Strategy, and next week there will be the next review from Termi8r. Up to then, good luck at the tables.